Joining me now, I have epidemiologist and science communicator at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Raywat Deonandan. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Well, the Premier there says they're cautiously looking at opening things up. He is careful to describe it as a trickle, and he says they'll be rolling out a framework, perhaps some places where people aren't close together, outdoor spaces. What do you think is going to reopen first?
Oh, that's a tough question. I will say that it has to be done in a staged format. I've heard it described as a dimmer switch approach. You open it up slowly. I think it's a tough question. I think he's right that anything outdoors is probably safer. Some restaurants might be able to open up. I know California was thinking about having a situation where a limited number of tables would be allowed and servers would have to be in full protective gear. Of course, you have to think about then how do you protect the bathroom, a shared bathroom experience. So any environment where intimate contact is not required and a smaller gathering of people is possible, fewer than 20 ideally.
What do you think of the golf courses reopening in Vancouver?
That's interesting, and I think it's probably okay because at golf you can be very far apart and you're outdoors. Right. Yeah, so it's probably fine. Keep in mind that as the temperature increases and humidity increases, the ability of the virus to be transmitted diminishes a little bit as well. Not a lot, but a little bit, and that's going to help.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting looking at the United States. I know in Georgia, they are reopening. That's a pretty high stakes moment. That's a big milestone for them. In Jacksonville, Florida, the mayor has reopened beaches, and there has been some backlash to that, but the mayor reasoned you can still enjoy the beach as long as you're physically distancing. You're not picnicking, you're not sitting close together, but you're outdoors getting some fresh air. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the challenge there is how to police it, because beachgoers tend to be party type of individuals. The temptation to cluster is strong. So if they can ensure a high degree of oversight, I think it's fine, but that will be the challenge.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the list. We're just getting this information now because they're coming out with it this afternoon. The list of things that will reopen, this is in Georgia: gyms and fitness centers, bowling alleys, body art studios, barbers, cosmetologists, hair designers, nail care artists, estheticians, massage therapists, schools related to those professions. That's a pretty extensive list.
That's an extensive list, and I'm not comfortable with all of those things. Unless, for example, your massage therapist is fully geared up with PPE, that has changed.
Well, I don't know what kind of a massage. Again, this is a very serious subject. I don't mean to mock her, but I can't imagine, like, what type of a massage are you getting if the person's wearing personal protective equipment? And I mean, it would be like being massaged by a rubber glove.
That's exactly right. So in that situation, the massage therapist becomes a vector for the disease. So if there's a capacity in place to test the therapist in between every client, that's safer. So it's possible to do these things so long as we have the capacity for testing and protection. It's unclear whether that capacity is there, and I'm skeptical. I have to say things like barbershops. I hope they open soon because I need a haircut. But again, you have to have the right equipment in place and the right policies in place. Other kinds of endeavors like bars, I'm not so sure about. I don't think that's a good idea. So as this happens, we have to be so careful. I know everyone says this all the time, but we have to take this seriously. And the threat of having another wave is real, and because of exponential growth, it can happen really quickly. So as the economy reopens slowly, we have to be ready to retreat indoors at a moment's notice when that call comes.
And I'm reading some of their minimal basic operations to keep things clean and safe. They say screening workers for fever and respiratory illness, enhancing workplace sanitation, wearing gloves and masks if possible, separating workspaces by at least 6 feet, implementing staggered shifts, teleworking where at all possible. So they do have some measures, but again, you're still not comfortable with what you're hearing there.
I'm not. Especially the testing or the screening for individuals with respiratory symptoms. We know that this is an asymptomatic pandemic. So the trick here is to identify individuals before they're symptomatic. That's where most of the transition seems to be happening. So if there's a procedure in place for testing the asymptomatic, I'd be a lot more comfortable. That's where we're going to get to eventually as more tests become available, especially the rapid on-site tests. When those tests are in our hands, then a lot of things can be opened up relatively quickly. Until then, I'm skeptical.
Dr. Bonnie Henry, the medical officer of health in British Columbia, said something interesting. And I wonder if this is something we'll look at here in Ontario. But the province's top doctor on the West Coast said when the kids do go back to school, it will be eventual and it could be some sort of hybrid. That's her exact quote, some sort of hybrid. So she said some older kids may continue to study from home and attend virtual lessons. But of course, you want to get kids who really require supervision back to school so their parents can go back to work. And she said, so perhaps there will be an alternating system where some kids are in classes certain days and others are in class other days so that everyone is able to maintain some sort of physical distancing.
This is an opportunity for administrators to step up to the challenge and work through some creative solutions around scheduling and that sort of thing. The word hybrid is used a lot in pedagogy to mean a variety of things, and we use it in universities to talk about a course that is partly in person and partly online. And definitely we're exploring that option for many of our courses come the fall, because we anticipate a second wave in the fall as well. So this kind of advanced thinking is commendable, and it needs to be done. And I've always said that this is not so much a health crisis as it is a health systems crisis. It's also an administrative crisis. So now that we've beaten down the caseload to something manageable, now it's time for the managers to step up and to put forth their creative ideas for how to unroll the economy in a creative, strategic, and safe way.
We're chatting right now with Dr. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist. Here's what I wrestle with. And I was wrestling with this, trying to understand it yesterday when they gave us that update on the modeling. They're saying, hey, good news, but also bad news. So good news, we've hit the peak earlier than expected. Hospitals are faring better than expected. Bad news, the number of long-term care cases continues to climb. And now we're talking about reopening the economy. These are just talks. But I'm trying to figure out how you reconcile these two different things that are happening in our province and how you reopen the economy when things are getting better for the general population, but not for older people and not for populations that are in long-term care homes and seniors' homes.
Yeah, a couple of things to think about. First off is there isn't just one epidemic. There are multiple epidemics happening in this country, different regions and different sub-regions. That includes, in any given city, the subpopulations, the wild population, those of us living out in the community, and the institutionalized populations, separate epidemics. So those of us in the wild, as I call it, we've seen a decline in cases. We've passed that peak, which is great. But those in the institutional capacity, those people are still suffering. Now, the good news for us is that there isn't a whole lot of interplay between those two populations. So we can actually unroll the economy, think about ways of returning to some semblance of pseudo-normalcy while devoting more resources taken from the ICU units in the hospitals that are prepped and putting them into long-term care facilities. The further good news is that we know how to address the crisis in these restricted populations. I use that term because I'm including long-term care facilities, prisons, work camps, any place where people can't move around a lot. We know how to approach that because all we need now is a lot of testing and a lot of control of movement, because the residents aren't going anywhere. We test them all, and if they're negative, then they're fine. If they're positive, we take them away and we isolate them. And the workers, now we test them again, and we control their movement such that they do not become vectors of further transmission. So that's not a difficult thing to do. It just takes administrative will and the application of the appropriate resources. So that's the good news. There is actually a solution that's available to us. So I see the announcement yesterday as being entirely good. I don't see a lot of bad news in it, except, of course, people are dying. That's always bad. But the good is that we know what to do, and we should be happy about that.
Finally, in the last minute that I have you, I want to quickly ask you about a study that was done by the University of Southern California, and it showed that an estimated 320,000 adults in L.A. County may have been infected with coronavirus. So these are preliminary results, and I want to stress that because I know the study has been criticized. However, it did show the illness is more widespread than current testing indicates, and it really contributes to the fear that some people have that there are silent carriers out there, people that have it and don't know it. I'm wondering what you think about the study.
It's inevitable that there are more people out there than we know about. I usually use the number 50. I take the caseload, multiply it by 50 to give me a real estimate of what's out there. That doesn't mean they're silent carriers necessarily, because they're probably isolated at home, so they will experience the cycle of the disease and not infect anybody else. The good news angle of this, it means that we're a little closer to herd immunity than we thought. Right? So we want to get to that 40 to 70% infection rate for everybody, or recovery rate rather, to make sure that everybody else is protected. So the closer we are to that, the better. It also means that there are probably more asymptomatic or mild cases than we thought, meaning that the proportion of cases that lead to seriousness and fatality is lower than we thought. So it's not quite as dangerous as a disease as we first suspected. It's still quite dangerous, but not quite as bad. So that's the positive way of looking at it. The negative way, of course, is that, yes, there are people out there who can still be infectious. But that's why we have this prolonged period of isolation, to let those individuals go through the disease cycle and end up being non-infectious at the end of the next 2-3 weeks.
Dr. Deonandan, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming back on. Always good to get those answers for our listeners.
Thank you.
Dr. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and science communicator at the University of Ottawa. If you have more questions,